Hey everyone, ready to get our minds blown? Today we're taking a deep dive into Black Swan events.
Yes, super fascinating topic.
Right. And to guide us, we're going deep into Nassim Taleb's book, The Black Swan, The Impact of the Highly Improbable.
Oh, great choice, a classic.
It really is. It's packed with insights on how to navigate a world that loves to throw us curveballs, a world full of surprises. Can't wait to break it all down with you.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about black swans is they're not just random. They show us how our thinking can be totally flawed when we try to predict the future.
Yeah.
Like, we're really bad at it.
Okay, so before we go too deep, can you give us a quick black swan example? I feel like that term gets thrown around a lot these days.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, imagine you're a turkey on a farm, right?
Okay, I'm imagining.
So every day the farmer feeds you, you hang out with your turkey buddies, life's good.
Sounds pretty idyllic.
Right. You start to think, hey, this is how it is, this is how it's always going to be, but then Thanksgiving rolls around. Yeah, that's a black swan for that turkey. Totally shatters its reality.
Poor turkey. I see your point, though. We get totally blindsided when we think the future is just going to be a repeat of the past.
Exactly. Taleb actually uses that turkey story to explain one of his key concepts, the difference between mediocristan and extremistan.
Okay, those sound like some made-up places. I'm intrigued. What are they all about?
Think of mediocristan as the realm of the average, the predictable. Things like height, weight, exam scores.
Yeah, right.
They tend to cluster around a middle ground, the bell curve, right? We could use that to kind of understand them. But then there's extremistan, where those rules just don't apply at all.
So, like the Wild West of statistics?
You got it.
Oh.
Things like wealth, book sales, war casualties.
Right.
A single event can have a massive outsized impact.
Wow, yeah. Okay.
And you want to know the crazy part? The bell curve. It's basically useless in extremistan.
So basically, black swan events, those really surprising world-changing events, they're more likely to pop up in extremistan, right?
Absolutely. And that brings us to a really big question. How do we even begin to deal with a world where these totally unexpected events can have such a huge impact?
That's a question for the ages. So I'm guessing Taleb has some thoughts on this.
Oh, he definitely does. He says one of our biggest problems is something he calls the problem of induction.
Okay, induction. Remind me what that is again.
It's basically this human tendency to look at past events and assume they'll just keep happening in the future, Like that turkey, we get lulled into this false sense of security.
Yeah. But we can't just stop using past experiences to make decisions, right? I mean, that's how we learn.
True. It's not about ignoring the past. It's more about being aware of its limitations. Recognizing that the future might not always follow neatly from the past, especially when it comes to those areas where black swans love to hang out.
I'm starting to see how this applies to, my own life. I've always assumed I'll be able to get a job in my field after I graduate. But what if that assumption's based on, a pre-pandemic job market? Maybe that's not such a safe bet anymore.
Yeah, that's a perfect example, and that's exactly what Taleb wants us to do. Question those assumptions and recognize that, there could be black swans lurking just around the corner, ready to mess things up.
Okay, so besides induction, are there other ways we, blind ourselves to black swans?
Definitely. Another big one is something he calls the narrative fallacy.
Okay, narrative fallacy. What's that all about?
It's this tendency we have to create stories to explain what happens, even when we're oversimplifying, we're forcing a cause and effect thing when there isn't one.
Ah, okay. It's like even when things are messy and random, our brains just crave a neat, tidy story. We want to feel like we understand what's going on, right?
Exactly. And Taleb uses his own experiences during the Lebanese Civil War and the '87 stock market crash to kind of illustrate this.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He saw firsthand how both of those events, they defied simple explanations. But people were desperate to create narratives to make sense of them, even when the truth was, more complicated.
That reminds me of how everyone reacted to the pandemic. I mean, everyone was trying to find a single cause or this clear-cut explanation for how it all started and spread. But in reality, it was probably a bunch of complex, interconnected things happening all at once.
Exactly. We fall into the narrative fallacy trap all the time. We crave those aha moments of understanding, but sometimes, the truth is just a lot messier and more random than we'd like to believe.
And the danger is those neat little stories make us overconfident. We've got it all figured out, when in reality, a black swan could come along and just totally shake things up.
Totally. And that brings us to another really fascinating fallacy that Taleb explores, the ludic fallacy.
Okay, ludic fallacy. Now that one sounds, break that down for me.
It's about the danger of mistaking the kind of predictable randomness we see in games for the real-life, messy, unpredictable kind of randomness.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like, because we can predict things in a controlled environment like a casino, we think we can also predict stuff in the real world, which is way more chaotic and complex.
You got it. Taleb uses this great story to drive this point home. He was speaking at a casino, and the managers there, they were completely obsessed with, mitigating gambling risks, things like cheating or card counting.
I mean, that makes sense, right?
Sure, but they totally overlooked other much bigger threats, like totally missed them.
Like what?
Things like changes in regulations, natural disasters, even just simple employee errors.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
All potential black swans that could have completely crippled the casino, but they were totally outside of their neat little risk models.
Okay, so the takeaway here is don't try to calculate the odds of a meteor hitting your house.
Well, I mean, you can if you want, but
Yeah.
the real point is that in real life, the risks are rarely as neatly quantifiable as they are in games. We need to remember that there are always going to be unknowns, the stuff we can't even imagine, let alone predict.
Right. Okay, so we talked about induction, the narrative fallacy, and the ludic fallacy. Always we kind of blind ourselves to black swans. Anything else we should be watching out for?
Oh, absolutely. There's another subtle one, but it's everywhere. Silent evidence. This tendency to, only focus on what we see and totally ignore what we don't.
Okay, I need an example for that one. Always a fan of concrete examples.
Think of a super successful entrepreneur. We see him and think, wow, brilliant, they must have had this amazing plan.
Yeah, I've definitely thought that.
But what we often miss are all the entrepreneurs who failed along the way.
Right, the ones who didn't make it.
Exactly. Their failures are silent, invisible.
So we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg, the successes, and we're ignoring this massive hidden chunk of failures, right?
Yeah. Taleb uses the story of Giacomo Casanova, the adventurer, the seducer.
Ooh, spicy.
Right. Casanova seemed to always escape misfortune, and he thought it was because he was just that brilliant and daring.
But I'm sensing a but coming.
Big but. What he failed to account for were all the other, Casanovas who took similar risks but didn't survive to brag about it.
Wow.
They're the silent evidence. All those people who made the same choices but didn't get the same outcome.
That is a sobering thought. We distort reality by just focusing on what we see and ignoring all the other possibilities.
Exactly. And that leads us to another really important idea in Taleb's book, the fourth quadrant. It's a way to think about where our knowledge is most vulnerable to those black swans.
Okay, I'm ready. Tell me about this fourth quadrant.
Imagine a map with 4 sections based on whether we can measure the randomness and how complex that randomness is.
Okay, with you so far.
The fourth quadrant is the Bermuda Triangle of knowledge. Super complex randomness that we can't really measure.
Makes sense. So that's where the black swans thrive.
You got it. And it's where our traditional models and predictions just fall apart.
So are you saying there are entire areas of knowledge where we're basically flying blind?
In a way, yeah. That's why it's crucial to understand the limitations of what we know and figure out ways to deal with all that uncertainty.
Right, okay. So we've talked about all the ways we blind ourselves to black swans, but what can we actually do about them? Can we even prepare for something that's, by definition, unpredictable?
$1,000,000 question. And luckily, Taleb has some practical advice on how to become more black swan savvy. But we'll have to save that for next time.
Okay, cliffhanger. I'm on the edge of my seat. Listeners, if you want to learn how to navigate this world of crazy, unpredictable events, make sure to join us for part 2, where we'll dive into how to become more robust and maybe even anti-fragile when it comes to black swans. Okay, so I'm still thinking about all those, traps we talked about last time, the ways we can get totally blindsided by black swans. It's kind of unsettling, right?
Yeah, for sure. It can be. But becoming aware of them, recognizing those traps, it's the first step towards navigating a world where, black swans are just a part of the game.
Right. So I'm ready for some solutions. Taleb must have some ideas about how we can actually deal with these unpredictable events. What's the game plan?
He does. And his approach is pretty cool. Instead of trying to predict black swans, which is basically impossible, he says we should just focus on becoming robust to them.
Robust, okay.
Yeah, so it's kind of like imagine building a house that can withstand an earthquake, even though you have no idea when or where it's going to hit.
I like that analogy. So it's more about being prepared for the unexpected, not trying to be some fortune teller about the unpredictable.
Exactly. And he has this one piece of advice that's super memorable. He says, don't cross a river if it's 4 feet deep on average.
Wait, what?
I know, right? Sounds simple, but it shows how we get caught up in those average outcomes and totally forget about the possibility of extreme events. Like, we're missing the big picture.
That's a really good point. It's like we might look at the average stock market return over the past decade and think, okay, this seems pretty safe, right? But what if that average is thrown off by like a couple of huge gains or losses? What if a black swan shows up and just wipes out years of gains, just like that?
Totally. And that's why Taleb says it's so important to remember that difference between mediocristan and extremistan. In extremistan, like, the average just doesn't mean much because one single event can totally skew the whole thing.
Okay, so how do we become more robust to these black swans? Like, what are some actual practical things we can do?
Well, one big strategy is to diversify our bets.
Classic advice, right? Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. But it's not just about financial investments. It's about, every part of our lives.
Okay, so elaborate on that. Diversify how?
Like having multiple skills, different sources of income, a bunch of options to fall back on if things go sideways, just in case.
I guess that makes sense. It's like having a backup plan, but for like everything.
Right. But it's not just about the plans. It's also about being adaptable, being able to switch gears quickly when things change.
That actually makes me think about something I've been struggling with lately, my career path. I've always been laser focused on this one specific career, but what if it turns out to be super vulnerable to, I don't know, automation or something? Like, what if a black swan comes along and just wipes out my whole plan?
That's a really good example of where this kind of thinking can be super helpful. Instead of putting all your energy into that one path, maybe explore some other related fields, develop some skills that can translate to different jobs, or even start a side hustle that could become your main thing if you needed to.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it like that. So instead of just planning for my dream career, I should also be thinking about how to, I guess, make myself more adaptable to all the crazy changes that could happen in the job market.
Exactly. It's not just about plan B. It's more like cultivating this whole mindset of adaptability, of being able to roll with the punches and maybe even, benefit from those unexpected events.
Wait, benefit? You're saying it's possible to actually gain from black swans? Isn't that kind of a crazy idea?
Maybe it sounds crazy, but Taleb talks about this concept of antifragility, which is like a whole other level beyond just being robust.
Okay, now my mind is officially blown. Give me an example. What does antifragility look like in real life?
Think about the human immune system. When you get exposed to a virus, it's tough. You might get sick.
Yeah, definitely not fun.
But your immune system, it learns from that experience,
Yeah.
right? And it becomes stronger, more resistant to future infections.
Yeah.
Like a positive feedback loop.
So what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but on a whole system level.
Exactly. And Taleb says we can use that same logic for our lives, our businesses, even our societies by embracing a certain amount of stress and disorder. By building in redundancies and fail-safes, we can actually become stronger and more resilient when things get unpredictable.
Okay, that's such a counterintuitive idea. We're always told to, seek stability, avoid risk, plan everything out perfectly. Are you saying a little bit of chaos can actually be a good thing?
That's exactly what he's saying. He even suggests that we should actively seek out certain types of stressors, the kind that push us outside our comfort zone and force us to adapt and grow.
I'm starting to see how this applies to personal growth. If I always stay in my comfy little bubble, I'm never going to learn anything new or develop new strengths. But if I embrace challenges and push my limits, I might actually become more resilient and adaptable in the long run, right?
Exactly. That's the whole point of antifragility. It's recognizing that a certain amount of volatility and uncertainty, it's not just inevitable, it can actually be good for us, for our growth and development.
Okay, I'm getting a handle on this, becoming robust and maybe even anti-fragile. But I gotta say, it's still a bit abstract for me. Can we get a little more concrete, some real-world examples?
Absolutely. Let's talk about something we all deal with, decision-making.
Perfect. So how can we make smarter decisions in a world where, black swans are just lurking around every corner?
One of Taleb's big recommendations is to focus on the process, not just the outcome.
Okay, focus on the process. What does that actually look like?
So it's not just about winning or losing, right?
Oh.
It's more about making choices based on a really solid understanding of the risks involved.
That makes sense. But how do we actually do that when some of those risks are, by definition, unpredictable?
Well, it starts with admitting that we don't have all the answers. We got to be humble, a little skeptical of our own predictions, and always open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
So it's about, embracing uncertainty and acknowledging that we can't control everything.
Exactly. And I know that can be a hard pill to swallow, especially in a culture that's all about certainty and control. But it's like step one for making good decisions when black swans are a fact of life.
Yeah, I get that. If we're constantly trying to, predict and control every little thing, we're going to be totally blindsided when something unexpected happens. But if we accept that uncertainty is just part of the game, then we can, start to figure out ways to deal with it.
Precisely. And one of the best ways to do that is to focus on what Taleb calls barbell approaches.
Barbell approaches. Okay, what's that? I'm picturing weights at the gym.
Yeah, it's like that. Imagine a barbell with weights on both ends. With a barbell approach to decision-making, we're basically spreading out our efforts, distributing them on both sides of the spectrum. We create this balance between, security and speculation.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Can you, break that down a bit more for me?
Sure. So on one side of the barbell, we have those safe conservative bets. Think like having a stable job, saving money, investing in low-risk stuff. Those things give us a sense of security, like a solid foundation.
Right. Kind of like the don't put all your eggs in one basket thing, but for our whole life strategy.
You got it. And then on the other side of the barbell, we have those more speculative bets, starting a business, going after a creative passion, investing in something with high growth potential, that sort of thing. Those have the possibility for huge wins, but also come with more risk.
So the barbell approach is about balancing out security and risk, having a mix of those safe bets and those riskier ones.
Exactly. And the key is finding the right balance for you based on your own risk tolerance, your goals, your situation. It's personal.
I like that. It's not about being reckless or avoiding all risk. It's about finding that sweet spot where you can have both security and the potential for growth.
Exactly. Plus, another cool thing about the barbell approach is that it lets you adapt. If one of your speculative bets, crashes and burns, you've still got those safe bets to fall back on. And if one of those safe bets starts to look shaky, you can always shift more resources to the speculative side.
So it's like having a built-in safety net while still being able to go after those, big wins.
Precisely. And that's why it works so well in a black swan world. It lets us deal with uncertainty, embrace both risk and security, and just adapt to whatever's thrown at us.
Okay, this barbell approach is making more and more sense to me. But I have to ask, how do we know which bets to make? How do we choose what goes on each side of the barbell? Where do we even start?
That is a great question. And that's where things get a little more nuanced. Taleb doesn't give us a formula, but he does suggest we develop something called epistemic humility.
Epistemic humility. Okay, that sounds a bit intimidating. What does that even mean?
It's simpler than it sounds. It basically means being aware of the limits of what we know. Admitting we don't have all the answers and being open to the idea that we might be wrong.
So basically the opposite of being arrogant or overconfident.
Yeah, pretty much. And Taleb says this epistemic humility thing, it's crucial for making good decisions when things are uncertain.
Okay. Yeah, I can see how that connects back to what we were saying about the narrative fallacy and the ludic fallacy.
Yeah.
If we think we've got it all figured out, if we're convinced we can predict the future, we're way more likely to make dumb decisions when a black swan comes knocking.
Exactly. Epistemic humility helps us avoid those traps. It lets us make decisions with, a healthy dose of skepticism. We're more aware of those unknown unknowns and ready to adapt when our plans, inevitably go sideways.
It's kind of freeing in a way. It's like saying, okay, I might be wrong, and that's totally fine. And it takes the pressure off having to be right all the time.
Exactly. And it opens us up to, learning from those mistakes and changing direction when we get new information.
So how do we actually develop this epistemic humility? Is it something you're born with, or can you actually learn it?
It's definitely something you can cultivate. One way is to actively look for information that challenges your beliefs, get exposed to different points of view, and have thoughtful debates with people who disagree with you.
That's a great suggestion, but it also sounds kind of uncomfortable. I mean, nobody likes to be wrong, right?
It's not about being wrong. It's more about being open to the possibility that you might be wrong. And realizing that learning and growing often means challenging what we think we know and expanding our understanding.
It's like that saying, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Right. And Taleb would probably say if you're the most certain person in the room, you're in the wrong room too.
Okay, so epistemic humility is about being open to new information, being willing to change our minds, and acknowledging that, none of us have all the answers. Got it.
Exactly. And that brings us to another big piece of Taleb's approach to decision-making, the emphasis on experimentation and tinkering.
Tinkering, like messing around with stuff in a workshop. What does that have to do with making decisions?
Well, Taleb says that instead of getting stuck in analysis paralysis, trying to map out every single possible outcome, we should just be willing to experiment, to try stuff out and see what happens, learn by doing.
So a more hands-on approach to decision-making.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that in a world that's, complex and unpredictable, we can't always plan every little detail in advance. Sometimes the best way to learn is to just dive in and see what happens.
That reminds me of the saying, fail fast and fail often. Is that kind of what Taleb is talking about?
Yeah, it's similar. He says we should embrace a certain amount of failure as part of learning. He calls it tinkering under opacity, which basically means we should be willing to experiment and adjust course even when we don't have all the information.
So it's about being okay with not knowing everything, taking smart risks, and learning from our mistakes.
Exactly. And that links back to what we were talking about earlier with antifragility. When we're open to experimentation and tinkering, we're basically exposing ourselves to these little stressors that help us get stronger and more adaptable over time.
Right. I'm seeing the connections now. Robustness, anti-fragility, epistemic humility, experimentation, they all point to this mindset that embraces uncertainty and sees it as a chance to grow, not some big scary threat.
That's a great observation. And that's really the heart of Taleb's message. To thrive in a world of black swans, we got to shift our mindset from trying to predict and control everything to embracing the uncertainty and seeing it as just a natural part of life.
So it's not about getting rid of uncertainty. It's about learning to, dance with it.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And that's exactly what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll dig into Taleb's strategies for becoming more anti-fragile and making better decisions in a world that's always going to be full of surprises.
All right, can't wait. Listeners, be sure to join us next time as we continue our journey into the fascinating world of black swans. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay anti-fragile. All right, welcome back to our Black Swan deep dive. The more we dig into Taleb's ideas, the more I realize how much our usual way of thinking, trying to plan for everything, can actually backfire and make us more vulnerable to those unpredictable events.
It's so true. We like to think we're in control, that if we just get enough data and build fancy models, we can predict and manage every risk. But as we've been talking about, that kind of thinking can be a real problem, especially when those black swans are out there lurking.
Right. We end up so focused on what we can measure that we totally miss the bigger picture, like all that unknown territory where those black swans are hiding.
Exactly. And that leads us to one of Taleb's most practical and maybe unsettling points, his critique of the way we usually do risk management. Because a lot of the models and approaches we rely on are just fundamentally flawed. They don't even take into account the possibility of those black swan events.
So he's not just talking about financial risk management, right?
Yeah.
This applies to how we think about risk in all parts of our lives.
Oh, absolutely. He uses this great analogy, that turkey that's been fed every day for 1,000 days.
Yeah, the Thanksgiving turkey.
Right. That turkey feels totally secure, maybe even builds little models in its head to predict when the food's coming next. But all those models just crumble on day 1001 when, Thanksgiving arrives.
Ouch, poor turkey. I'm starting to feel a little bit like that turkey myself, surrounded by all these potential black swans.
I get it. But the point is that turkey's models were based on a bad assumption, right? That the past is a perfect predictor of the future. And it's so easy to fall into that trap, especially with things like financial markets, political systems, even our own health.
Okay, so then what's the alternative? If our usual ways of managing risk are so off, how are we supposed to make decisions when these unpredictable events could just pop up anytime?
Taleb suggests we need a pretty big shift in our thinking. Instead of trying to predict and control every little thing, we should focus on becoming, robust and anti-fragile. It's not about eliminating risk entirely. It's about learning to live with it, and even better, to actually thrive because of it.
Okay, we've talked about robustness and anti-fragility, but I need a refresher. How do those ideas actually apply to, making decisions in real life?
Sure. So think of it this way. A robust system can handle those shocks and disruptions, the unexpected stuff, without falling apart. An anti-fragile system actually gets stronger from those shocks. It's like it levels up.
Right, okay. That makes sense. But how do we make ourselves more robust and anti-fragile when we're making those tough choices?
Well, Taleb has a few key strategies. One is that barbell approach we were talking about before. Remember?
Yeah, it's the whole like balance between security and taking some risks.
Exactly. So with that barbell approach to decision making, we spread out our efforts and resources, not putting all our eggs in one basket. On one side, we have the conservative, low-risk bets, the things that give us stability and security. And then on the other side, we have those more speculative, higher-risk bets, the things with big potential, but also more uncertainty.
So it's like having a diversified portfolio, but for like our entire life.
Exactly. And the great thing about the barbell approach is that it lets you adapt and be open to those unexpected opportunities. Like, if one of your speculative bets takes off, it can more than make up for any losses on that conservative side. And if one of your safe bets starts to look shaky, you can just shift your resources to the more speculative side. It's about being flexible.
I love that. It's like having a safety net built in, but still allowing yourself to like go for those big wins.
Right. But of course, the question is, how do we choose those bets? How do we decide what goes on each side of the barbell? It seems a little tricky.
It is. That's where things get more, I guess you could say more intuitive. Taleb doesn't give us a perfect formula, but he does offer some guiding principles. Like, he tells us to consider our own risk tolerance, our goals, and what's going on in our lives. And he really stresses the importance of optionality.
Optionality. Okay, I'm not familiar with that term. What's that all about?
It's about creating options for ourselves, having different paths we can take depending on how things play out. It's like not getting stuck on just one plan, but staying flexible and being able to change direction if we need to.
So like having a plan B, C, and D, just in case plan A blows up in our faces.
Pretty much. And optionality, it's not just for our careers. It can be about relationships, investments, all sorts of things.
Can you give me like a real life example of how optionality would work? Sure. Imagine someone who loves to write, but they also need, a steady paycheck. They could get a regular job in a related field like journalism or marketing, while also writing fiction or poetry on the side. That way, they have that stable income, but they're also keeping those creative doors open. If the writing takes off, they can switch gears. If not, they still have that solid career.
I love that example. It shows how we can create options without having to make those like all or nothing choices.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a big part of navigating this world of black swans. It's about being prepared for a bunch of different possibilities, not just the ones we think we can predict or control.
So we talked about the barbell approach and optionality. Anything else Taleb recommends for making better decisions when things are uncertain?
Yeah, he's big on taking those small, calculated risks, what he calls tinkering under opacity.
Tinkering, like messing around in the garage.
It's similar. It's about, experimenting, trying things out, even when you don't have all the information or a perfect plan. It's about learning by doing.
Kind of like that lean startup idea where you get a product out there fast, see what people think, and then adjust based on what you learn.
You got it. And it's not just for businesses.
Yeah.
It's about having this mindset of constantly learning and adapting, being willing to change course based on new information and those, unexpected curveballs life throws at us.
It makes sense. Instead of getting stuck in that fear of the unknown, we can just start taking small steps, learn as we go, and adjust if things change.
Exactly. And that ties back to what we were talking about earlier with epistemic humility. If we admit we don't have all the answers, it's easier to experiment and learn from our experiences.
Like saying, hey, I might be wrong, but I'm going to try it and see what happens.
I love that. It's such a more resilient way to think than always needing to have all the answers right away.
So we've covered a lot today. Robustness, anti-fragility, the barbell approach, optionality, experimentation, epistemic humility. Wow, it's a lot to process.
It is a lot. But the cool thing is, all these strategies, they're all connected and work together. They all point to this way of thinking that, embraces uncertainty and sees it as an opportunity for growth, not something to be afraid of.
And that's really Taleb's main message, right? It's not about trying to see the future. It's about developing a mindset and some strategies that help us not just survive, but really thrive in a world that's always going to be full of surprises.
Absolutely. And that's why his work is so relevant. He doesn't give us easy answers or simple solutions. He gives us a way to think about the world, some principles for dealing with uncertainty, and this call to action to become more robust, more anti-fragile, and more adaptable, no matter what comes our way.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Black Swan, I think the most important question we can ask ourselves is, what does it mean for me to be more Black Swan savvy? How can I use these ideas in my own life?
That's the question, isn't it? And I think we each have to find our own answer based on what's going on in our lives and what we want to accomplish.
But in the end, it's about accepting that uncertainty is just part of life and developing the resilience and adaptability to not just survive, but to thrive in a world that will always keep us guessing. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Black Swan. We'll be back soon with another exploration into some fascinating ideas and knowledge. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay anti-fragile.
Thank you for tuning in to the Power Book of Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join our growing community. Click the bell icon so you never miss an update. We have so much more inspiring content coming your way.